Welcome everyone to the October Brown Bag Learning Series, a tour of fashion history with Catherine Byrne. Catherine is a visual artist, a clothing designer, and a teacher. She graduated with honors from Boston University with a bachelor's in fine arts degree in painting and later earned an A.A.S degree. Catherine, what is an A.A.S degree?
That is an associate of applied science.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I had already been in the industry, and I went back to school to get the degree in fashion design and to learn more about everything that entails. So
Very cool. All right, and that degree is from Parson School of Design in New York City. And she has an extensive background in the fashion industry. She's worked in costuming, product development, and production coordination for Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, among others. And after over a decade of being in New York City, Catherine developed her own brand, which is very, very cool, and currently works on the faculty of the Danforth Art School in the Framingham State University. And I am our representative of the Framingham Public Library. My name is Allison. I'm the head of reference. And once again, thanks everybody for joining us. So I'm in a minute going to turn it over to Catherine. But for anyone who hasn't done a brown bag program before, Catherine's going to share her screen, go through her presentation. If there are any questions or anything of that sort, please type them into the chat and we'll do a brief Q&A at the end. I will also post in the chat a link to our program evaluation form. I'll post it now at the beginning and again at the end for anyone who needs to duck out early or joins us late. But yeah, with all of that being said, I will turn it over to Catherine.
hello. I will introduce myself a little bit more. So I have always been interested in historical fashion since I was very young. It definitely went hand in hand with my interest in, also, doing fashion myself and learning how to cut and sew. And I also love art, and I love how fashion and art merge, but it's just been a lifelong interest of mine. And so we thought this would be a fun opportunity to share my pretty extensive and somewhat motley accumulation of knowledge. And also it's an expansion of what I do teach to my students in fashion. So I teach 6th to 8th graders, and I also teach high schoolers fashion design. And the history component is important because it is all connected, and it's important to look at what's been done before. And so we do have a lot of fun with it. So I might not cover every single thing in history. It feels like each of these slides could be a doctorate in and of itself, where you could learn so much more. But I'll just share with you what I've got. If you have any questions, please just write it in the chat, and and we can talk at the end as well. And there's so much to talk about within each subject. So without further ado, I will share my screen and I'll begin. Here we go. So this is a pretty short history. And there are, people who study this. There's so much that one could dive into. But to begin with, it's good to start with what fashion is. And there's a difference between getting dressed and what fashion is. I mean, if you defined fashion, it would be a manner of doing something, a popular trend, but in my opinion, it's a way of expressing oneself as well. And in looking at fashion, we learn about the people. And so in a way, I'm not just interested in fashion, I'm interested in the people. They really go hand in hand. And there's so much to learn from fashion by looking at it. So here we have some very old, when did it begin? Probably as long as people have been wearing clothing. We wear clothing to protect ourselves. But in the end, it is a cultural language. And we learn very much from this. Here's one of the oldest known garments that we know of, that was found in Egypt. It's, I believe, carbon dated to be 5,000 years old. And it's interesting to look at this closely because it has pleats. So it's interesting to know that someone at that time was so carefully embellishing something with this detail. I'm going to also mention a few resources as I go along, if you want to write these down, because I've taken my resources, a lot of it's already in here, but also from many different sources, but I will share them with you as I go along. But anytime there's an exhibition about fashion and its history, I try to go to it. And so one of my dreams is to go to this place, the Kyoto Costume Institute. It's called the KCI. And I really recommend writing down this particular link because they actually have an archive. If you're interested in this, you can actually see some incredible examples of many different periods of dress, like throughout time. And they take, it's an incredible lesson in conservation as well, because they have climate control, and it's a whole conservation of these, these examples is a whole field of study in and of itself. But here's one more example of some things that we can see right here in Boston. So this particular dress, it's a beadwork kind of network of netting that they believe went over a linen dress. It's one of the earliest surviving examples of such a thing. It was found in Egypt, and it was reassembled from about 7,000 beads. And basically what they did is they had to kind of see how they were laying, and they had to reconstruct it. I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been, but the original beads were blue and blue-green, but they have faded. But this is actually at the M.F.A. This particular caftan, I'm not going through too much of medieval garb, but this particular caftan was found. It's from the early 9th century, the Western Caucasus. I believe that's area around the Black Sea. But you can see that it's extremely beautifully made and woven. They had looms at this time, and that looks like a very early type of jacquard. A jacquard is basically a very intricate way of weaving that creates design. And I think this one actually had some squirrel fur, but I don't see it, but it was listed on the description. But so I'm always interested in the fashion industry and what that industry looked like. We know what it's like now. We go to Fashion Week, we have seasonal offerings, that these companies make. I know a lot about the industry now, but I've been interested in what it used to look like for a long time. So here's just some information. So basically this etching on the left is actually rendered to show what he's wearing. So even as far back as 1629, people were very interested in fashion and sharing fashion ideas. I include these pictures on the right because basically global travel in the 1600s changed everything. And people were very interested in sharing what was happening in other parts of the world. Imagine if you were a wealthy Dutch merchant and you were wearing something that was from the Orient. It would basically show that you were someone who was extremely worldly, who probably had the money to even know about that type of clothing. And it became very fashionable to share ideas. And also about the making at this time. If you were wealthy, if you would have your clothes made by a dressmaker or a tailor. And also I'll talk about this later, but recycling clothing is very interesting to me, but everybody would upcycle their clothing because it was so valuable. But in order to have something new made, or even to have something altered, you would want to share illustrations in order to show it to a dressmaker or a tailor, or maybe a tailor would want to show you as a client what they could do for you and make for you. So here, this is an etching. And as early back as this time, there were these literary journals that some consider the first fashion magazines. So we'll talk more about that later, but they had these different names. There were many. Le Cabinet des Modes, Le Journal des Dames et des Modes. So these are just a few. So I love to tell my students how important the Silk Road was, and about history and how closely intertwined it is with fashion. Italy was early on a very important fashion center. We all know, you probably learned in school the story of Marco Polo, who was a merchant who traveled this road, and trade became extremely important. And if you see this line, I don't know if you can see it, that was the road basically. And so one of the main, sorry, I'm going to read this to you, but Venice, Italy was a prime trade location at the end of the Silk Road. So he brought with him luxury items like pigments, spices, and silk from China. And if you look at a map of Italy, Venice is a port. It became a very important location on the Silk Road that would continue on further into Europe. So silk production was introduced to Italy between the 9th and the 11th century, and afterward, Italy became among the largest suppliers of silk fabric to all of Europe and beyond. Today, among other things like leatherwork, exceptional quality couture fashion, Italy is known for its textiles. I actually worked as a fabric buyer for Ralph Lauren, and so many of our textiles came from Italy, Loro Piana, like all these different, and many of those textile houses have been there for centuries. So, so this is an interesting fun fact. In Milan, the making of luxury goods was an industry of such importance that in the 16th century, the city gave its name to the English word milliner, meaning fine wares like jewelry, cloth, hats, and luxury apparel. By the 19th century, a later variant, millinery, had come to mean one who sold hats or trims. And in France, you'll see later, a milliner was someone who sold trims and embellishments and fine wares. So early influencers, knowing all this about Venice, we can understand why it became such a wealthy place and why it's such a beautiful place to visit today, because this trade brought great wealth. And it made some very wealthy people. So one example was the powerful de Medici family, who made their money early on in the wool trade and then in diversified investments. And this was a famous noble family for centuries. So as you can see from this portrait, the finest silks were being produced with increasingly complex looms and weaves. Damasks, jacquards, and brocades are special, each one slightly different weaves that you still see coming out of Italy. So one can study these paintings to see, a lot about the fabrics that are being made and the different designs. This particular portrait is of Elenor De Toledo. She was the first wife of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was taken in 1545. She was one of the first fashionistas, and there are many paintings of her. Another thing that was interesting to me is that in his humanist poetry, the author Petrarch describes his muse, the fair Laura, as perfectly cast and virtuous. You know, this was the Renaissance, so of course we're going back to virtue and all these classical ideals. But this particular book of poetry was so popular during the Renaissance that it affected the beauty standards. And so blonding your hair was a thing. So you'll see a lot of paintings. This particular girl on the right probably was not a natural blonde, but there's lots of evidence of people using many different mixtures of, you know, henna, natural bleaching, sunlight, herbs, and roots in order to blonde their hair to be more like the virtuous Laura. Another very good resource that I urge you to look at is FIT.NYC.edu fashion. You can look at, if you look at the FIT website, they have a wonderful sort of fashion history section of that, which tells you a bit more about some of these things. They have kind of like a timeline, so you can go through and see. So here are some of my, as I've been going around my own fashion travels, some things have always interested me. And one of these was this thing called the ruff. And I'll just give you a little background about the ruff, but it began as a simple high collar of the early century. This is the 1500s, trimmed with a modest frill. So there was this woman named Marguerite of Navarre, and it was said that she had an unattractive neck. And she would wear this ruff. She was also a fashion influencer and a royal, so everyone was looking up to her. So it did catch on as a trend. It was made of linen or lace that was later starched. There is evidence of this paste that was made of wheat and other grains, and sometimes pigments. I think yellow was a very popular color for this. It was folded with a poking stick while still damp, dried, and then stored in a bandbox. Hence, there's a phrase that says, this so-and-so just stepped out of a bandbox, which means impeccably dressed, looking dapper. A bandbox can also be thought of as, you know, if you starched your collar, like later on in fashion history. But I think the earliest known reference to that phrase came all the way back from when ruffs were being kind of sort of stabilized and dried. They got a little bit over the top. They were sometimes reinforced with wire and decorated with jewels. And you've probably seen many paintings of Queen Elizabeth, but she was definitely a fan of ruffs. If you know history, there was some issues that she had with Scotland and her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who, you know, allegedly was plotting against her. So there was a time when she banned the color blue in the ruff, because blue is the color of the Scottish flag. And I thought that was interesting. So here are some examples of ruffs in just a noble couple. It looks like Queen Elizabeth is made out of lace. And yeah, there were many variations. Some were very small and they got really big as well. So we will talk about this a little later, but the hoop skirt was pretty old, actually. The earliest version is called the farthingale. It actually originated in Spain, and the Spanish word was verdugado. But if you look up that particular translation, it'll say executioner, but an earlier translation was green wood. So Catherine of Aragon, who was Henry VIII's first wife, was actually from Spain, and he was not her first husband, but they say that she brought this fashion into England in about 1501 when she married Henry's brother, Arthur. But these hoops were made with rope, bone, or willow, and they were used by court women to show their high social position and wealth. Because if you were wearing this type of thing, it would show that you had enough money to buy more material to cover this particular skirt, because you increased the amount of material. And if you're a pattern maker, you know that you had to kind of cut it in a way that was like this, which increases the amount of fabric used. So this is a particular example of a farthingale from the late 1500s. Here is a fashion etching of a noble woman. And the corset pretty much sticks around on and off for about 350 years after this, but the earliest known examples are from the 1500s, and they were made out of whalebone. Whaling had been around since, I believe, the 12th century at least. So they had whalebone, horn, buckram, and they were referred to as whalebone bodies. So a stay or busk is placed vertically in the center of the torso to keep it straight. But yes, so corsets become a fashion staple for the most part for the next 350 years. But there are a couple breaks in that, which I'll talk about, but they change in shape drastically over time. They were worn for various reasons: to beautify, ensure modesty, improve the posture, and support the back. And corsets for children were thought at certain periods in history to keep them healthy and improve posture. And you'll actually see lots of paintings and see lots of references to children wearing corsets. I have sort of a theory where corsets kind of become like an armor, sort of a psychological armor for people. There was a time in the 1800s where I believe people thought that children were very fragile. And so they kind of, I believe, put these corsets on them, probably to make them sit up straight. They were not trying to make them slimmer. They were just trying to, in a way, kind of protect them. That's my sort of theory. I don't know, but it's very interesting. Here's a very old German corset from about 1598. And then on the left, you'll see corsets were sometimes worn outside of the clothing. So you would, in this particular painting, from 1610, she's wearing her corset outside of her undergarment. So there's this great quote in Much Ado About Nothing: fashion wears out more apparel than the man. So already imagine William Shakespeare is joking about how frivolous and quickly changing fashion is. So we already know that it's something that people make, it's a big part of their lives. Here's a fencing doublet from 1580. If you ever read some, if you read Shakespeare and you hear the word doublet and you've wondered what that looks like, that's what that looks like. It's a closely fitted jacket. That one's padded, probably for protective reasons, because it was for fencing. This particular man is actually supposed to be a tailor. He's got scissors. He's wearing a doublet. And these strange kind of skirt pants are called trunk hose. And they would sometimes be stuffed and made to kind of stick out. And that was called, when they were bombasted hose. If you've ever wondered what a jerkin is, this is a jerkin. It's basically a vest. So that was worn by lots of people because it's, I don't know, I find the vest to be a very practical garment because it's not too hot, not too cold. Here's a jerkin from about 1610 to 1625. And so that was Italy, but I want to just jump ahead to France as a fashion capital and how that all began. So we know now France as being, and for the last many hundreds of years, as being known for their fashion. They pride themselves on fashion. So when did this begin? When did this really become something they were world famous for? So they owe their chic to Louis XIV, the Sun King. His reign began in 1643. And in case you're wondering, he did call himself the Sun King. So I was always wondering where he got that name, but he named himself the Sun King. So he clearly felt that he was the center of the universe. So nothing says it more than that when you call yourself the sun, you know. So this was also at a time when he was a Catholic, and, you know, the monarchy felt they had the divine right to be king. And so he was definitely born with a, you know, a sense of entitlement, a sense of importance, but he grew up to have he had very lavish taste. This was the Baroque era, if you know art. It was very luxurious. No expense was spared. It was very in your face, a little bit over the top. And it was a very wealthy time because we talked about that travel and that trade. So this was evident in the spectacular Palace of Versailles, the expansion of which he commissioned. Versailles was originally a hunting lodge, but it became what it's known for today because of Louis XIV. But it also was evident in the way that he dressed. He also recognized the importance of luxury goods to the national economy. So, you know, love him or hate him, he brought a number of artistic industries, including the textile trade, which was under the control of the royal court, to become the worldwide arbiter of style. France would become the worldwide arbiter of style. That was his goal. So from the 1600s and for centuries to come, the highest quality of fabric and materials were to be found in France, and fashion from then on becomes integral to their economy. So with that comes the popularity of the fashion plate. There are so many existing surviving examples of this. So they were colored by hand, but the fact that they were engraved meant that they could be reproduced, which was exciting. So they could be printed. Some of the earliest journals were the Mercurial Gala, which was founded in 1672. This name refers to the god Mercury, who was the messenger of the gods. And it also was echoing, there was a previous journal called Le Mercure France. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it was the very first literary gazette, which had been founded in 1611. So this one was the continuation of that. So the goal of these literary gazettes, because now we know that it's all about fashion from here on, was to inform elegant society about life in the courts and intellectual and artistic debates, poems, music, gossip, and fashion. So in the late 1700s, fashion plates illustrating the latest styles were circulated by print sellers in a publication called La Galerie des Modes. And there were many other versions of this. So here he is, Louis XIV, looking great. And then here's just a couple of fashion plate examples. Now, I just wanted to talk about court style because it affects things later on for a famous figure that we'll learn about. But just as he chose the sun as his emblem, because the sun was associated with Apollo, god of peace and arts, one who regulated all things, Louis XIV expected to be glorified and honored in his royal court. So he established a norm of court dress where nobles would showcase their wealth and status through fashion. So he did it more than other monarchs, but he did require different dress codes for each court function. So nobles, by wearing something new each time, would often go into debt since clothes were so incredibly expensive at this time. And there are many historians who argue that he intended this to enhance his own power. But there was a lot of pressure. These two fashion plates on the bottom were actual fashion plates that were the expectation of court dress from the 1600s. The one on the right is a noble woman who's wearing a pretty classic example of court dress, the habillé de coeur from later on. But so in the presence of the king, men were required to wear a habit habillé, which is dress clothes is the translation. They were extravagant coats made from velvet or silk, and women were expected to wear a grand habit de coeur, which is the translation of that would be court dress, which was embroidered, sometimes displaying the shoulders. But being a well-dressed courtier was a sign that you could afford a wig maker, barber, tailor, jeweler, perfumer, and shoemaker. So as you can imagine, it would have been fun to be a fly on the wall for that, because it was a showcase of wealth, basically. They were very proud, and it was a time of great excess. So another thing about this time that I thought was interesting is during this time, fairy tales were very popular. Hundreds of fairy tales were published in literary journals at that time. And one of the most popular of those fairy tales was Cinderella. Cinderella had a couple different versions, but the moral of the story was that when she's beautifully dressed and when she's looking amazing, you know, everything is well in the world. So, but a little more about the fairy tales. They were written by Charles Perrault, was an author of fairy tales at that time, who published hundreds of fairy tales, and some credit him with sort of being the godfather of the modern fairy tale. And many other fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Sleeping Beauty, Bluebeard came out during this time. And he's an interesting character as well. So, and Louis XIV loved these, and they were all published in these journals. And they were for children, but everyone read them. So, and they all had a moral tale as well. Okay, anyone who studies art is probably familiar with Rococo. But with the Rococo age, generally in the 1700s, we will see another big surge in fashion illustration. Marie Antoinette is always a subject of interest because she expressed herself with fashion in a life and a role that was limited. So I've read it and listened to a lot about her, and she was actually not quite as groundbreaking as people think she was, but she was fashion forward. She can be compared to sort of like a modern day, like Lady Diana. You have to look current, but you're also proper. So she was kind of, it's a tight and a little bit of a tightrope that she was walking with fashion. So, but she became excessive later on. So either way, she was a source of fascination, criticism, but definitely a huge influence on fashion. So many illustrations for this time are satirical, which gives you an idea of how much she and her peers pushed boundaries. Fashion journals played an important role in the dissemination of news about fashion, luxury goods, etiquette, and court life. By the way, lots of common people also looked at these journals. It wasn't just for wealthy people. You know, they were sold on the street and anyone could buy these publications, which is why I think of them as like a true magazine. And I was listening to a podcast recently about this time, and there was a frenzy for fashion in the later 1700s that many believe, in hindsight, was a sign of growing discontent, because when everyone's tripping over themselves to get to the next new hot thing, it's sometimes a sign that you're not content and that you're always looking outward for something new and different. And there are a lot of studies that have been done about what led up to the revolution, but this was an interesting thing I heard. More about her. She was married when she was 14 and became queen when she was 19. And when she first came to France from Austria, she was actually said to have pretty simple tastes. She was just this girl from Austria. She was not the person that we knew her to be later. But the pressure of being queen, the demands of the court life, and fashions moving quickly at the time, a taste for luxury, and generally all of that made her into a fashion enthusiast and an icon. So to stay with the time, she had many personal style advisors. She had a personal dressmaker named Rose Bertin, whom she invited into her home to collaborate on her fashions. So at the time, this was a little bit frowned upon because Rose Bertin was actually from very humble roots. She was, I'll tell you more about her in a minute, but it was not proper to bring someone who wasn't a noble into your boudoir, basically. But that was the only way that Marie Antoinette could make sure that she was on top of the moving fashion trends, because she didn't have Instagram. She didn't have all these things that we have. So by having this kind of fashion style, like basically a personal fashion stylist with her, close to her, she was able to really stay on top of these quickly moving trends. Here's a picture of Marie Antoinette by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, 1783. Okay. So a little more about Rose Bertin, because she's an interesting character. She was a French milliner, and at this time, milliner meant a dealer in small articles relating to dress. At this time, I can't stress enough how incredibly expensive clothing was. Someone from that time, I can't even imagine if they came forward in time and saw how many clothes people have. They took countless hours. Every single thing that people wore at this time, have to remember, were made by hand. Materials and textiles were very expensive. So a person at that time, even someone with very great wealth, would recycle their clothing. And there was, I love this, there was a big secondhand clothing trade. So, consignment was in, like people would sell, upcycle, and gift their cast-offs. So nobles were known to give away their old clothes to servants, and Marie Antoinette gave many clothes to her ladies in waiting. And in the 1700s, women's fashion stayed, I don't know if anyone knows a little bit about it, it stayed pretty static for a long time. Here are two differences. Robe à la Française, I don't know if you've seen the sack dress, was one version of a court style that became a little more common, and robe à l'anglaise was just it's fitted in the back, but the front had a kind of piece here called a stomacher, and then it had this outer dress. Later on, those became joined, but in general, that style became pretty much the same for a few decades. And so to change their clothing and to be current, they would often just change the trims. So you might change just this part of your sleeve, you might change ribbons on the front. And so that's really what a marchand du mode like Rose Bertin did. She would come into someone's home and basically help them update what they had, and provide them with all these beautiful, expensive ribbons and laces and ways to kind of change what they had. She was also a dressmaker, and she did make dresses for Marie Antoinette and lots of her royal peers. But she was a successful self-made entrepreneur who she was famous, world famous. But she some people credit her with being the first ever haute couture designer, because she had a lot of say over what clients wore. No longer was, a dressmaker just coming in and doing what the client asked them to do. She was advising them and creating things for them of her own design. So it's pretty impressive, but she was also very loyal, confident of Marie Antoinette. And she did escape the revolution, if anyone's wondering. She survived it, but it's close. But this is a dress by hers. The satin dress to the bottom is a said to be a Rose Bretagne dress, and this is her on the left. The first celebrity hairdresser. This queen had a celebrity hairdresser. His name was a personal hairdresser who became a celebrity hairdresser. His name was Elenor De Toledo. And he would actually collaborate with Rose Bretagne, and he created coiffeurs, hairstyles that became all the rage all over Europe, and it was called the pouf. So hair would be accessorized, stylized, cut into defining scenes, and modeled into shapes and objects, ranging from gossip. And there's a famous one where, here's the real one on the bottom left. The Belle Poule, they put a naval vessel on top of her head to honor. They were very proud of their involvement in the American Revolutionary War. And they were proud of their French Navy. So she wore a ship on her head. It was actually very patriotic. It was a little bit, mocked, but it wasn't, it was pretty patriotic. And she had a particularly famous hairstyle called the Inoculation. This is very interesting, especially regarding current times. At that time, it was very controversial whether or not you would be inoculated against smallpox. So she was trying to convince the public to get the inoculation of smallpox. It was very scary and risky, of course. And so she actually had a particular hairstyle that OTA helped create, which was called the Inoculation. It was basically, the description is a serpent belonging to the Greek god of medicine twined around an olive tree that symbolized anyway, only the description remains, unfortunately. A picture does not remain, but her husband's grandfather had smallpox. I believe they had it within the family. So that's interesting. And contrary to other popular belief, they were actually usually made with their own hair. They were not wigs. They would take their own hair and put this powder in it that was made with wheat, which was kind of frowned upon because pretty soon there was this famine going on. And so using wheat for something like that was just not cool. But they would put so much that you could really manipulate the hair, and then would use pads. And they basically, I'll just look at a chat. Yes. We should definitely try some hairstyles today for sure. So these, obviously on the right is a real etching of mockery of these hairstyles. There's early satire. The ship on the right is a satirical version. The one on the bottom left is the real one. The one on the top right is satirical, but they were a bit made fun of. By the way, that top left picture is the only known picture of Elenor De Toledo. Here's a pretty cool article from The Atlantic. How fashion defeated the 18th century anti-vaxxers. Pretty cool. Early marketing. Did you know that as early as 1600s, people used promotional mini mannequins called Pandora Dolls or Pandora that were sent to clients to show design and fabrics? Reportedly, Marie Antoinette had hundreds of them. Rose Bretagne would make these and give them out. So these were used in order to show a client, and they were sent all over the country. Any noble would receive these by parcel to, kind of give them an idea of what a particular dressmaker could make for them, and what the materials would look like, and what the style would look like. this was promotional stuff. This was all they had. They didn't have any pictures. You know, they would say, this is how it will look. And they would do a little miniature version and send them to people and use these in their, probably in their shops, to show what these different styles would look like. And if, as someone who designs myself, I think they're a pretty good idea to kind of figure it out myself as a designer, just to kind of say, oh, I'll have this go here. How's this going to look? Will this, you know, and to try out different trends. So these were used for a very long time, well into the 1800s, you know, until photography happened, basically. And until Charles Frederick Worth started using human models in the 1850s. Fashion fallout. I'm calling this fashion fallout because this is just a very interesting thing that happened with fashion that is closely intertwined with historical events. So on the left is Marie Antoinette. Sorry, if you see any typos, I apologize. By Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was her favorite painter. You'll see tons of paintings by her and her friends at that time. And she's wearing a particular dress called the Gall, or la chemise à la reine. And it became, that means the queen's dress. So believe it or not, this white, simple, peasant-style dress became the height of cool in Europe because it portrayed a provincial simplicity that aligned with Enlightenment ideas of la liberté, modern democratic spirit that was starting to kind of come to the forefront. At that time, she was spending a lot of time at this little house. Anyone who's been to Versailles may or may not have been to the Petit Trianon, which is her little country home on their Versailles grounds. It's about a 20-minute walk from Versailles. And she was basically like playing peasant girl, like at this place. She was reported to have had animals. She would bring her friends. But this was a style of dress that became extremely popular. And it was very different from what was expected of her in terms of what she was supposed to be wearing at court and in general. She was already pretty unpopular. And when this particular painting was presented, it caused a major scandal. And part of it is because even though the French were kind of obsessed with what the British were doing fashion-wise, because they were probably jealous because they had certain liberties that they didn't have, I'm just gonna look at a chat just a second. Oh yes, just beautiful. I was there when I was very young. I wish I could go back. That's on my bucket list. And I definitely want to go to the Petit Trianon. So basically, even though they were somewhat envious of the British with their freedoms, and the nobles in Britain could like just go hunting or riding, and they had certain freedoms that the French didn't really have with this pretty oppressive monarchy and system of just expectations and restrictions. You know, it was very segmented into different class of people. They were enemies with the British. So basically, cotton was a major export of Great Britain and its colonies. And in France, silk was their main kind of industry and source of pride. So when she was wearing cotton, that was kind of like, that's it. They actually had to take the painting down because it was so upsetting to people. They considered it unpatriotic. And they thought it looked like she was wearing a chemise, which is an undergarment. And it went downhill from there. She was, before 10 years from then, she was already imprisoned. But just so you know, it was actually a very popular outfit. It was worn by lots of different women. So we'll see this later. But now what's happening in France is there's economic hardship. They were in debt because of the American Revolution. They were in debt because of the king's extravagant spending and his predecessors, poor harvests, drought, cattle disease, skyrocketing bread prices, which is the direct reason why Versailles is raided not too long later. And also, in hindsight, this dress expanded the slave trade because now cotton is in higher demand, which required this labor. And so it's just a sad 2020 hindsight realization. Here are some very wealthy women that are wearing that particular chemise à la reine. Here's some fun facts. So skipping ahead, I was listening to a podcast called Dressed, The History of Fashion. I recommend it highly. Some credit this time period as being fashion's first hipsters. So basically, fashion and the events before, during, and after the French Revolution are tightly linked. So the period that followed Marie Antoinette's execution in 1793, known as the Reign of Terror, saw thousands put to death by guillotine and thrown into prison. So then France was also at war. So there was a draft, sort of like, and so they were trying to get young men to go and fight this war. With this new Jacobin regime, they did away with religious orders, and they actually mandated a new type of state-sponsored form of worship. It's a very complicated time. I'm just scratching the surface, but to sell this new kind of way of being, this new movement, this new revolutionary spirit, and to unify everybody, they needed some serious propaganda and PR. So to sell this and to drum up spirit, they put celebrated artist Jacques-Louis David, incredible painter, to work. He became kind of like the official artist of the revolution. Up until the previous, the years following the revolution, clothing was a source of great bickering, and because clothing was always such an important thing to the French people, this new order became very kind of also sort of attentive to fashion and how they were going to create basically like a new kind of uniform look. And so David actually created these like costumed pageants and created this new uniform look of sorts. And you will see here, they definitely, it's not very subtle, were sort of turning to classical antiquity, where the seeds of democracy are first sown, to give this new revolutionary cause nobility and to get people to follow this. So that same dress, that chemise à la reine, was already in fashion. This white dress basically became even more kind of extreme in it was a little more skimpy. So this woman is wearing no sleeves, as you can see. They basically did away with the corset. They were basically going straight back to classical antiquity and wearing, almost like a toga type thing. And it was risque, but it was also kind of admired. And there was even a word for these women, and they were called les merveilleux, the marvelous ones. And the men's outfits it was kind of like a youth subculture, became this strange outfit on the top left. And they basically, people have tried to study this strange look. It was more about self-expression for men. So their styles include this longer coat, wider lapels, fancy patterns, layers of cravats, like all the way up here. And some argue that it's in a visual allusion to protecting their necks. These people, by the way, literally, like while this was going on, there were people being guillotined like down the street. They had strange accessories, including hoop earrings, a spyglass, which was, some argue, an affectation of poor sight to escape the military. They had this weird hairstyle called a la victime, which was meant to be a sort of recreation of the hair that people had on their way to execution. They would just cut their hair in a terrible way. And they even had an affected way of talking. So it was just a wild crazy young person, new hipster look that was going on at the time. And it's pretty fascinating, actually. But here's David in the top. And then that particular waistline stays high for the next 2 decades. If you're wondering about the corset sort of took a back seat for a while. During this time, though, they did wear a kind of basically like a bra sort of, and it was called the short stay. And it was just a corset that was highly shortened.
Catherine, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know we're at about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This has been
sorry,
fabulous.
Guys.
I love it, though.
Oh, okay. Going on and on. So very quickly, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. I don't know if anyone's been to Slater Mill, but it's really fascinating. When I was there, they turned the whole thing on and you could see the way the water worked, but it changed everything. I'll just kind of like quickly go through. The department store emerges in the 1800s, because what happens after that is that now textiles can be mass produced. It changes the course of fashion. And I have a lot more, but I'm so sorry. I thought it would take much less time.
No, and also please don't rush. For my own personal edification, would be thrilled to have you back to talk about this more. So if we want to kind of wrap up at like a halfway point and then do a round 2, that would be fabulous.
Oh, okay. I'll do a couple more pages maybe. And did we want to do any questions or comments with anyone or so far?
I haven't really been seeing any in the chat.
Okay. I see a couple. Oh, yes. Slater Mill is amazing. Yep. Okay, so department stores. And then, yeah, I'll have to do like another round 2, but basically so much happens after this where the Industrial Revolution, places like Slater Mill, and changes the course of fashion and the way we wear clothes and the way we buy things, for sure. So the very first department store was Le Bon Marché in Paris in 1852. And Elias Howe patents the first sewing machine. This is what it looked like, 1846. This is on the left. That's the first sewing machine. He had the patent for it, but then Isaac Merritt Singer came along, and they had a little bit of a patent war, but Elias Howe, I believe, won. So, but here was Singer's version. But before this, a lot of people had been playing around with this idea of sewing machines, especially tailors and people who'd been working in that industry were trying to find a quicker way to make things. Oh, why were the hoop skirts worn outside the dress? Oh no, corsets were worn outside the dress. So in that particular picture, corsets, you'd have a shirt on, and then the corset back in the early, the 1500s, sometimes corsets were worn outside the dress. But hoop skirts were always worn under the skirt. Then we get to Haute Couture. I just have 2 more minutes, but basically, I don't know if anyone's heard of Charles Frederick Worth, but he was the first, the father of Haute Couture. And he basically created the very first high fashion house. Haute Couture means high fashion, the House of Worth in Paris. And what this meant was that for the very first time, a fashion designer was going to be an artist, someone who makes stuff and then you wear it. So I'm going to create it and you wear it. So it changed the whole relationship between how things are made and how we dress ourselves. That was him. He had this really cool signature look. But then after that, Paris became known for its couture houses, and it had a criteria that you had to abide by. You had to have a certain amount of workers. You had to have a certain amount of runway shows that you showed. You had to have, 15 full-time workers and 35 looks in a show twice a year. And many followed. And then I'll leave you, maybe this is the last thing that we can do. At the same time that Charles Frederick Worth was dressing the most famous and wealthy people in this country, this person was also dressing the royal classes of America, our royals. So her name was Elizabeth Keckley. She was the personal seamstress to the First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln. She became known as a great dressmaker and designer, and she catered to Washington's socialites. She was a freed slave. She was able to secure the freedom of herself and her two sons with her skill and her incredible talent. So she was also a savvy businesswoman and went on to sell her own design. So here is some of her work. And she also was a teacher. She taught girls how to sew, and she's pretty amazing. And we should know more about her. And I think we're out of time. I'm sorry. Do we have to go?
Yeah, our time is up, but this was absolutely fantastic. I thought it was very interesting saying how influencers have kind of existed this whole time. Fashion influencers have always been a thing.
Yes, it's always been, and it's just as we're dealing with all these struggling currents of people and thoughts and arguments and politics, it's always been happening, and it's always been evident in the way people express themselves, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. I did just see a pop-up in the chat that part 2 could be history of fashion in America, because it seems now we're kind of transitioning into that in the latter part of your slides. So that is a fabulous idea.
Yes.
So yeah, you will definitely hear from me. This was wonderful.
Okay.
And thank you again to Catherine, and thank you everybody for joining us. I am going to
everyone.
Put the evaluation form in the chat one more time for anyone who missed it. And be sure to keep an eye out on the library website for what will inevitably be a part 2 of this.
I hope so. There's so much more. I mean, this whole century, my goodness. So
I know, I'm just thinking of the development of fast fashion as an industry could, I mean, as you said, every single one of these slides could be a dissertation. So
exactly, yeah. It's almost like, where do I, there's so much. So it's barely scratching the surface. So, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I'll stop share. Sorry.
Yeah. This was wonderful. All right, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you all again. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your Friday and the weekend. And we'll see you all around the library soon.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone.